The snow had not yet settled, but the cold was already biting into metal. Engines coughed in the gray morning air as German soldiers moved carefully through rows of abandoned American fuel drums. They were everywhere, hundreds of them, lined neatly along a forest road that only days earlier had been marked on Allied maps, not German ones. A German colonel stood still among the noise. His boots were wet. His gloves smelled of fuel. This was success, at least on paper. Captured supplies, full tanks, trucks running again after weeks of rationed movement and stalled offensives. Men who had learned to measure fuel by the cup now saw it pooled in abundance. Yet something was wrong. The colonel did not smile. He did not rush his men forward. Instead, he looked down the road, past the fuel, past the vehicles, and tried to imagine how much effort it had taken the Americans to place all of this here. And then the thought arrived, quiet and irreversible. If this much fuel could be lost without stopping them, then it meant something far worse than shortage. It meant replacement. And in that moment, surrounded by captured American strength, the colonel began to understand defeat. By late 1944, Germany was no longer fighting the war it had planned. It was fighting the war it had been forced into, a defensive struggle shaped not by bold maneuver, but by scarcity. Fuel had become the Reich's most crippling weakness. Germany entered the war without natural petroleum reserves. From the beginning, its armies depended on synthetic fuel plants and captured oil fields to keep tanks moving and aircraft airborne. Early victories in Poland and France had masked this vulnerability. Campaigns were short. Distances were manageable. Consumption remained within tolerable limits. But war has a way of expanding. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 shattered Germany's logistical balance. Vast distances devoured fuel faster than it could be replaced. Vehicles broke down. Supply columns lagged behind advancing spearheads. Even before the winter cold set in, German formations were already learning that modern war was not won by movement alone. It was sustained by supply. By 1944, the problem was terminal. Allied bombing campaigns systematically dismantled Germany's synthetic fuel industry. Refineries at Luna, PP Plitz, and other critical sites were struck again and again. Output collapsed. Luftwaffe flight hours were slashed. Tank units trained less, moved less, and fought less. Entire formations existed on paper but could not operate in reality. German doctrine had always emphasized decisive action, rapid concentration, encirclement, destruction. But decisive action required mobility, and mobility required fuel. Without it, even the best-trained formations became static. Orders were issued with an unspoken caveat: only if fuel allows. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, German commanders were already calculating operations backward from fuel availability. Counterattacks were delayed. Reserves were immobilized. Tanks were held not because they were unnecessary, but because they could not be replaced once committed. Every kilometer mattered. Every liter mattered. And every American advance worsened the imbalance. As Allied armies pushed eastward, Germany's fuel situation did not merely deteriorate. It collapsed under the weight of continuous movement, retreat, and reaction. The Wehrmacht could still fight. It could still inflict casualties, but it could no longer choose where or how to fight freely. This was the reality German officers carried with them by the winter of 1944. A war where victory was no longer about seizing ground, but about surviving consumption. And it was against this backdrop of rationed engines and stalled ambition that German forces would soon encounter something profoundly unsettling: the American way of sustaining war. While Germany fought to conserve every remaining leader, the United States fought an entirely different kind of war. One defined not by limitation, but by flow. American military planning treated logistics not as a support function, but as a decisive arm. From the first large-scale mobilization, U.S. commanders assumed loss. Ships would be sunk. Depots would be overrun. Fuel would be destroyed or abandoned. None of this was considered failure. It was expected friction. What mattered was not protection of every supply point, but the certainty that whatever was lost could be replaced quickly. continuously, and in overwhelming volume. By 1944, American industry was producing fuel on a scale no other nation could approach. Refineries along the Gulf Coast and inland waterways operated around the clock. Pipelines, rail networks, tanker fleets, and truck convoys formed a system designed for redundancy. There was never one route, never one depot, never one solution. Fuel moved like water. In Western Europe, this philosophy took physical form. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy and advanced rapidly across France, American planners did not slow the pace to secure supply lines in the traditional sense. Instead, they extended them aggressively. Temporary depots appeared in fields, forests, and abandoned villages. Fuel was stored wherever it could be unloaded, in drums, in bladders, in hastily organized dumps that could be relocated or sacrificed without hesitation. Speed mattered more than permanence. To German observers, these supply points appeared dangerously exposed. Roads were crowded with trucks. Fuel sat in the open. Protection seemed minimal. From a German perspective, shaped by scarcity, this looked reckless. An invitation for disruption. But it was not recklessness. It was confidence in scale. American logistics planners assumed that some depots would fall into enemy hands. They planned accordingly. Behind every forward dump were others already being filled. Behind every destroyed convoy were replacements rolling forward from ports that themselves were expanding in capacity week by week. Where German logistics revolved around preservation, American logistics revolved around replacement. This difference shaped everything. American armored units could advance knowing fuel would follow. Air forces could fly daily missions without calculating whether tomorrow's sorties would be possible. Commanders issued orders without adding conditions. Movement was assumed. Consumption was accepted. And this was the reality German forces collided with as the front lines shifted in late 1944. When German units pushed forward, whether through counterattacks, local breakthroughs, or sudden thrusts, they began to encounter American supply sites in numbers that defied expectation. Fuel dumps that should not have existed. Truck parks that seemed endless. Supplies stacked not for survival, but for momentum. To seize one of these sites was, tactically, a success. To understand what it represented strategically was something else entirely, because for the first time, German officers were not just seeing American strength in motion, they were seeing it at rest, in surplus, waiting to be used. And that realization would soon change how victory itself was understood. For German soldiers, the first encounter with American fuel dumps was not tactical, it was psychological. Men who had learned to shut engines down on downhill slopes now walked through rows of full drums. Drivers who had memorized fuel gauges like lifelines watched gasoline spill casually onto frozen ground. The contrast was jarring. It did not feel like capture. It felt like intrusion into a world that obeyed different rules. Scarcity shapes behavior. By 1944, German troops were conditioned to think in terms of limits. Every movement had to be justified. Every kilometer had a cost. To suddenly stand among supplies that ignored those calculations created a quiet dissonance. It raised a question no order could answer. How many more of these do they have? This was not envy. It was something colder. An awareness that effort and discipline could not close this gap. On the map, captured fuel dumps looked like opportunity. German commanders understood what fuel meant. With enough of it, armored units could maneuver again. Trucks could move infantry forward. Local breakthroughs could be exploited instead of abandoned. In theory, seizing American fuel restored mobility, the single most decisive factor Germany lacked. But fuel alone did not equal freedom. American fuel dumps were forward nodes, not lifelines. They existed to shorten delivery time, not to sustain the entire system. Capturing one did not disrupt the flow behind it. It merely removed a small portion of what was already en route. German units soon discovered the limitation. Vehicles refueled once. Sometimes twice. Then reality returned. Ammunition, spare parts, bridging equipment, air cover, none of it followed at the same scale. Mobility without depth became a brief illusion, not a solution. The fuel worked. The system did not change. What unsettled German officers most was not what they gained, but what the Americans seemed willing to lose. From a German viewpoint, fuel was strategic treasure. From an American viewpoint, it was consumable. Losses were logged, replacements ordered, routes adjusted. There was no pause, no reassessment of intent, no visible hesitation. American units did not counterattack frantically to recover every lost drum. They advanced elsewhere. They redirected flow. They treated capture as inconvenience, not catastrophe. This revealed a fundamental asymmetry. Germany fought to avoid loss. The United States planned to absorb it. And once that difference became visible on the ground, in frozen fields filled with abandoned abundance, the war began to look less like a contest of skill and more like a problem of arithmetic that could no longer be solved. German leadership had been trained to think in decisive blows. Cut the supply line, capture the depot, disrupt the enemy's rhythm. In earlier wars, and even in the early years of this one, that logic held. Armies collapsed when their logistics were severed. But by 1944, the nature of the enemy had changed. American supply was not a line. It was a field, wide, layered, and resilient. There was no single artery to cut, no critical depot whose loss would paralyze operations. German officers continued to search for decisive logistical targets because doctrine told them such targets must exist. The fuel dumps they captured seemed to confirm this belief until nothing stopped. Orders from higher command still assumed that seizing material would translate into operational advantage. On-T-ground colonels and battalion commanders began to realize the disconnect. Successes were real, measurable, and immediately irrelevant. The war was no longer shaped by brilliant interruption. It was shaped by industrial momentum. Germany's war effort relied on endurance, stretching limited resources through discipline, rationing, and improvisation. The United States relied on industry, producing beyond immediate need, then producing more. This difference mattered more than tactics. An American fuel drum represented not a precious asset, but a fraction of output. Its loss did not echo backward into factories or refineries. It was already accounted for, replaced before reports reached headquarters. For Germany, fuel was irreplaceable. Captured fuel could not be replenished. When it was burned, it was gone forever. Every liter consumed was borrowed time. German officers began to see the equation clearly. They could win engagements, they could capture equipment, they could even advance temporarily, but they could not reverse the flow that made American losses invisible. Defeat does not always announce itself with retreat or surrender. Sometimes it arrives as understanding. For experienced German officers, the sight of American supply dumps triggered that understanding. It was not panic. It was not despair. It was clarity. They saw a war they could no longer influence at the strategic level. Decisions made months earlier, in factories, shipyards, and planning offices thousands of kilometers away, had already determined the outcome. At that moment, the war stopped feeling fluid. It became fixed. And when war becomes fixed, the next event is no longer uncertainty. It is inevitability. That inevitability would soon take shape in a single, unmistakable moment, the capture that was supposed to restore German momentum, and instead confirmed its end. The advance came in fragments, not waves. German units moved forward where opportunity allowed through gaps, over frozen ground, along roads the Americans had used only days before. It was not a grand offensive in motion, but a series of sharp thrusts driven by urgency and dwindling options. And then they found it. Fuel dumps lay ahead, partially abandoned in the haste of American repositioning. Drums stacked in disciplined rows. Tankers pulled off the road, engines cold. Trucks parked nose to tail, their loads intact. The signs of withdrawal were clear, but so was the scale of what had been left behind. Orders moved quickly. Secure the area. Refuel everything that can move. Salvage what cannot. Engines roared back to life. For the first time in weeks, German vehicles ran without calculation. Tanks were topped off. Trucks filled their reserves. Columns that had been immobilized by scarcity surged forward with renewed strength. On the surface, it worked. Local advances followed. Positions were overrun. American rear elements fell back. Reports flowed upward, noting captured supplies and restored mobility. On situation maps, arrows extended again, thin, cautious, but moving. For a brief moment, it felt like reversal, but as the fuel burned, another reality became visible. The captured dumps were large, far larger than German planners had expected. Not a single depot, but many, and each appeared to be one of several, not the center of the system. The colonel overseeing the capture walked the perimeter slowly. He counted trucks. He estimated volume. He asked how long the Americans had likely been using the site and how quickly it could be rebuilt elsewhere. The numbers did not comfort him. This fuel could move his unit today, perhaps tomorrow. But beyond that, there was no continuity, no follow-on supply, no deep reserve behind it. When it was gone, his forces would return to the same constraints as before. More troubling was what the fuel represented. If the Americans could afford to leave this much behind, then it meant their true strength lay elsewhere. Already moving, already replenished, already ahead of him. The capture had restored motion. It had not restored control. And as engines burned through borrowed abundance, the colonel began to understand that this moment, this apparent success, was not the beginning of recovery, but the threshold of something final. The realization did not come all at once. It formed as calculation. The colonel began with simple questions. How many vehicles could be fueled here? How far could they move? How long before consumption erased the gain? The answers were precise and devastating. Even used perfectly, the captured fuel could not change the operational picture. It could only delay its return. Then came the deeper reckoning. This depot had not slowed the Americans. Their pressure elsewhere had not eased. Radio intercepts and frontline reports showed no collapse, no pause, no frantic effort to recover what was lost. Instead, American formations continued advancing on parallel axes, supplied by routes that did not pass through this captured ground. The colonel understood what that meant. The fuel he now commanded was not essential to the enemy. It was surplus positioned forward for convenience, not necessity. Losing it forced adjustment, not retreat. It created inefficiency, not paralysis. For Germany, inefficiency was fatal. For the United States, it was routine. Standing among rows of drums, the colonel grasped the scale behind them. Each container represented not just fuel, but confidence, the certainty that more existed behind it, and more behind that. He imagined the ports, the railheads, the convoys, the factories that never saw this battlefield but decided it all the same. This was not a war of maneuvers anymore. It was a war already decided by throughput. In that moment, victory ceased to be a question of courage or competence. German soldiers still fought well. Their officers still issued sound orders. None of that mattered against a system that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The colonel did not share this thought aloud. There was no need. The war would continue. Orders would be followed. Men would advance until fuel ran out again. But internally, the struggle had ended. He had seen the future of the battlefield, and it did not belong to those who captured supply. It belonged to those who could endlessly create it. And once that, the immediate aftermath did not announce itself with collapse. There was no sudden withdrawal, no dramatic surrender, no visible admission of defeat. German units continued to fight, continued to maneuver where they could, continued to execute orders with discipline, but something had shifted beneath the surface. The fuel that had briefly restored movement was consumed quickly. Engines ran. Columns advanced, then gauges dropped back toward empty. The familiar constraints returned. Unchanged by the momentary abundance, vehicles were parked again. Priorities were reimposed. Mobility narrowed. Operationally, the captured fuel achieved what it could: local advantage, temporary reach, short-term flexibility. it did not alter the strategic situation. American advances elsewhere continued at pace. Pressure on German lines increased, not decreased. The front did not bend around the captured depots. It flowed past them. Reports from higher command reflected this reality indirectly. Gains were acknowledged, but Folloman resources were unavailable. No reserves appeared to exploit success. No additional fuel arrived to sustain it. The captured supply had been consumed in isolation, without depth or continuation. Meanwhile, Allied logistics absorbed the loss seamlessly. New depots replaced old ones. Convoys rerouted. Timetables adjusted. To American commanders, the loss registered as data, not disaster. The tempo of operations did not slow enough for German units to capitalize. What had once been a theoretical imbalance was now observable. German officers could see it unfold day by day. Tactical success no longer accumulated. It evaporated, and with each evaporated gain, the war became less about opportunity and more about endurance against inevitability. The realization that had formed at the fuel dump now manifested in operations. Effort without leverage, movement without consequence. This was the beginning of the end, not in terms of dates or declarations, but in terms of meaning. The fighting continued, but its outcome no longer felt contingent on what happened next. And as winter deepened, that understanding spread quietly through command posts and briefing rooms, preparing the ground for what would follow when the arithmetic of war could no longer be postponed. In the months that followed, the implications of that moment became impossible to ignore. German forces across the Western Front were not defeated by a single battle or a single loss, but by a pattern that repeated everywhere. Fuel, vehicles, and supply came into contact with American scale. The Wehrmacht continued to fight with professionalism. Units withdrew in order. Counterattacks were planned carefully. Local successes were still achieved, but none of them accumulated into momentum. Each gain dissolved as soon as it was made, absorbed by a system designed to outlast disruption. Postor German analysis would later describe this phase with striking clarity. The problem was not courage. It was not tactics. It was not even numbers of men or tanks in isolation. It was the impossibility of matching a logistical system that treated loss as expected and recovery as automatic. American logistics did not merely support operations, it dictated them. Where German commanders hesitated over fuel allocations, American commanders assumed movement and planned accordingly. Where German staff officers calculated what could be spared, American planners calculated what could be replaced. The capture of fuel dumps had revealed this asymmetry in its most concrete form. It showed German officers that even success no longer translated into advantage. The enemy's strength did not reside in any single depot, convoy, or route. It existed in continuity. As the front collapsed inward toward Germany's borders, this realization shaped decisions quietly. Commanders conserved what little fuel remained. Armored units were held back, not for decisive action, but for delay. Mobility was reserved for retreat rather than maneuver. The war's final phase in the West unfolded with grim predictability. Allied advances pressed forward, supplied relentlessly. German resistance slowed them, but could not stop them. The outcome was no longer shaped by moments. It was shaped by capacity. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the truth the colonel had grasped among the fuel drums was widely understood. The war had been decided not at the front line, but behind it in factories, refineries, ports, and planning rooms far from the sound of gunfire. And that understanding would shape how the conflict was remembered, studied, and explained long after the engines fell silent. Defeat in modern war rarely arrives with a single sound. It does not always come with a broken line or a raised white flag. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the form of understanding. The German colonel did not surrender when he stood among captured American fuel. He did not abandon his duty or his men. He continued to fight, to plan, to obey orders. But something essential had ended. The belief that effort alone could still change the outcome was gone. What he had seen was not just abundance, it was continuity. The United States, had turned logistics into a form of power so vast that individual losses became irrelevant. Fuel was not protected because it did not need to be. It was replaced. Movement was not earned through conservation, but guaranteed through scale. In such a system, bravery still mattered, but it could no longer decide. Germany's war had become a struggle against arithmetic, and arithmetic does not negotiate. This is why the capture of American fuel dumps did not mark a revival, but a revelation. It exposed the truth that modern warfare is won long before the front lines meet, in preparation, production, and the ability to absorb loss without hesitation. When the war ended, historians would explain the defeat in numbers. Tons produced ILs, transported, hours flown. But for those who stood on frozen ground in 1944, the meaning was simpler. Victory belonged to the side that could lose and keep moving. And once that truth became visible, defeat was no longer a matter of time.